So welcome everybody to the first of a series of online talks organised by the Folklore Library and Archive. So before we start, I'll just tell you a little bit about the organisation and who we are. The Folklore Library and Archive is a registered charity based here in the UK, which is dedicated to the collection and preservation of folklore materials in all forms. So that's documents, document archives, video, audio, artifacts, and so on. We have two patrons. Michael Rosen, the children's author, was our original patron, and we've just been joined in our second patronage by Joanne Harris, author of Chocolat and many other fine books, who is our new patron. So these talks are all fundraisers for the charity. So we pay our speakers fairly, as you should always do. But a proportion of the talks, what we like to call profit, once Eventbrite have taken their bit as well and whatever, will go towards supporting the work that the charity does. And we are very grateful to Icy and to all of our speakers who will be joining us throughout this series for giving up part of their fee in order to help the charity. It is very much appreciated. So the next talk after tonight's will be in 3 weeks' time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Now we've got everything set up and going, the whole program will hit Eventbrite fairly soon. So do follow the Folklore Library and Archives Eventbrite page if you want notifications for the other talks, or our social media, Facebook or Blue Sky, or Instagram, and obviously our website as well, which you can see next to me in my background. So we'll talk a little bit more later on about all of those things again, but in the meantime, I shall disappear and I shall invite Icy to share her screen. And we will kick off with tonight's talk. Many of you will know Icy from her fabulous folklore podcast, which has been running for how long now, Icy? I tried to work this out earlier and I couldn't
Six and a
remember.
half years.
6.5 years. So a fine back catalogue of podcasts and blogs, and I'll invite Icy to share her links at the end of this talk as well to find her online. Also, author of Rebel Folklore for Dorling Kindersley and very, very recently Ghost Lore. I thought there couldn't be a book that was more beautiful than Rebel Folklore, and then they published Ghost Lore as well, and now I cannot separate the two. They are both absolutely wonderful, and very beautifully illustrated. So we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end too. But in the meantime, we shall sit back and enjoy learning all about the spiritualism and mediumship and seance work, which used to happen historically in Icy's part of the world. So, Icy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just before we start, obviously the image that you're looking at on screen at the moment is Jesmond Old Cemetery. And that is often referred to as the sort of Highgate of the North. In some ways, it's one of our garden cemeteries. It's where a lot of Newcastle's kind of great and the good are buried. And the slope at the top of this part is essentially like the equivalent of like the expensive seats. So we had like class distinctions even then. But we're going to have a look in this talk with the Victorian fascination with spiritualism, but we are going to have a special focus on the popularity and reception in Newcastle and Manchester. Clearly, I'm biased when it comes to Newcastle. It is where I am from. And I think there's often a lot of tendency to focus on London in most matters. But I think it's quite interesting to actually see the difference as to how it was received in Newcastle. And then it's actually even more different again in Manchester. So we will have a look at the roots of spiritualism to start with, and then we'll have a look at some of the tools that the spiritualists developed kind of via the different types of seances that you would find in both Newcastle and Manchester because they are different. But I want to go back to the seeds of spiritualism, which were actually originally sown in 1762 in a narrow and somewhat unfortunately named alley between Smithfield Market and the Old Newgate Prison called Cock Lane. And obviously, there's an illustration of it on the left and what it looks like now, according to Google Street View. So you can see it's changed a bit. It became the site of a rather infamous haunting, and I'm saying that in inverted commas because it was basically a hoax. But it was called the Cock Lane Ghost. And in this, a young girl who lived in the house seemed to be able to contact the spirit of a dead woman, who, through this young woman, accused her common law husband of poisoning her. And the whole thing, as I say, was proven to be a hoax. It was actually faked by the girl at the prompting of her father. And it is worth noting that the dead woman actually died of smallpox, which is very different from the arsenic poisoning, which she was actually, or he was accused of at the time. And it also is worth noting that the father owed the accused murderer a lot of money. So, as always, money was at the bottom of it. But the reason I bring this up, because it was so far before spiritualism, is that it is sort of the point of time during which the knock once for yes, twice for no code starts to appear in some shape or form. And basically, it fades away from view, and sort of becomes a bit of a curiosity that did inspire plays and illustrations. Hogarth has a go at it in one of his engravings. Um, but it's worth bearing it in mind while it's not the actual start of the story, it's a little bit like the prequel. Um, that does actually have a little bit of a connection to what comes later. So for the actual starting point, but again, there are these echoes backward through time. We need to go to Hydesville in New York State in 1848. And this particular house is where the Fox sisters lived, particularly Kate and Margaret. And they apparently made contact with a spirit in their home. Kate was 11, Margaret was 14, and they told a neighbour that they could hear noises around bedtime every night. Actually brought the neighbour in to listen, and the noises are basically just raps, but they weren't random ones like you might get if your house was settling, or like me, you can make your joints crack on command. And that's the big point, the on command part, that the raps responded to questions that were put to him. And one of the questions they asked was, how old is the neighbour? And the raps actually counted out the correct age. So I hate to think what that number actually was. It might have actually died off as a silly joke, but it was the fact that one of the locals then told the story to someone else who told it to someone else, and thus the story took off. And the rumour began once the sisters moved to Rochester to live with their older sister Leah, that the spirit in the old Fox house was that of a peddler who'd been murdered in the house 5 years earlier. So people decided, well, let's go and have a look if there's anything in this. So, good example of early investigation. And they found hair and bone fragments. No way of knowing if they were even human, but people did then think, aha, there must be some truth in this. The girls can really talk to the dead. And here they are. Now, in 1848, they were subject to plenty of investigation to see if they were actually real in their communications or if they were faking things. And this is Kate, Margaret, and Leah as adults. And they actually took their show to the town hall to show 400 locals how they could talk to the dead. And by 1888, the girls had actually admitted that it was a hoax, but by that point, it had completely caught on, was beyond their control, so it didn't really matter what they said. People had their own beliefs about whether this was genuine. Now, this also took hold at a time when people were aware of a thing called mesmerism, and this is the idea that magnetism held the universe together, which it's not entirely necessarily wrong. It's just the way it was understood was lacking in some of the core grasp of physics, shall we say. But they also thought that by using hypnosis, a mesmerist could then manipulate your magnetic field and thus fix any problems by doing so. I mean, let's be honest, people buy weirder things from Gwyneth Paltrow, so we can't really look too unkindly on them. But this was an idea that was sort of taken off at the time. You also had the popularity of the ideas of Emanuel Swedenborg, and he had divided the afterlife into heaven at the top, hell at the bottom, and then the world of the spirits in between. So you've got all of these ideas floating around at the same time, and then kind of just waiting for someone to do something with them. And this was the work of Andrew Jackson Davis, who took said elements and slammed them together. So he took the work of Swedenborg and the ideas around mesmerism, and then decided that actually there must be something to all of this after all. He also later claimed to have heard a voice telling him that he would actually have proof of spirit communication, and he allegedly heard this on the day that the Fox sisters first heard the rapping. So you get characters like this. Nowadays we would call them influencers. But he put all of this together, well, somewhat wrongly, but there we go. And what's really interesting is the fact that out of all of these beliefs and everything that then got sort of smushed together to form what we know as spiritualism, it did actually become an official religion in 1893. There's it's less dogmatic in some ways around a code of beliefs, but it's more about like a series of principles. And the main one is the existence of a spiritual world alongside the material world that we live in, which is something that quite a lot of different ideologies have in common. So that in and of itself, fair enough. Why not? It's about, they did actually have an idea of taking personal responsibility for your own thoughts and actions, which, as far as I'm concerned, fair play. And there was also an idea that you would reap what you sowed, which again, not completely uh, beyond the bounds of what other people believe. There was a belief in God as the creator of the universe, but what spiritualism did was it actually removed the threat of hell, which is really interesting. So the dead all went to the same place, regardless of what you did in life, which is probably why they also needed these ideas around personal responsibility, because if you remove the threat of hell as punishment, you need there to be something sort of in its place. But because the dead all went to the same place, the living could contact them for a fee, of course. And I think that this is the point where spiritualism really differs. It's the idea of communication with the dead being a fundamental tenet of everything. And as I say, it there's different beliefs, as I say, within that way. Like, yeah, um, that's not that different from other things. The interesting thing about the removal of hell, though, one of the pieces I came across was actually a letter someone had written in Manchester, and they were actually complaining about spiritualism because of the fact that people were turning away from Christianity and towards spiritualism precisely because they'd removed the threat of hell, and it became more about you choosing morally how to live based on this personal responsibility and the idea that like actions had consequences. So like spiritualism has this weird punk element to it, which is quite interesting, and it was cool to see that people were actually debating that at the time. Spiritualism also a very interesting reflection of the times. And lots of the mediums that shot to fame were women. Now, obviously, there's a lot of male mediums as well, as we're going to discover throughout this talk. But the female mediums are quite interesting because this is a period in which women had very little power in society. If they got married, had any money or property, that all went to their husband. If they didn't marry, they didn't really have a huge range of career options. But mediumship, on the other hand, was ideally placed for the way that like femininity, quote unquote, was being portrayed at the time, and has unfortunately had a bit of a resurgence. But mediums needed to be passive, impressionable, and sensitive, all of which were considered feminine, so therefore ideally suited supposedly to women. So women couldn't do particular jobs or participate in society because they were believed to embody these qualities, but then meant that they could actually earn quite a good wage as a medium, which is an interesting sort of paradigm. What's really interesting is lots of mediums then channeled messages from the spirits to tell women to divorce their useless husbands. So there's a subversive element there, which I'm quite fond of. But this is where I want to have a look at how it spread in the UK using Newcastle and Manchester, because obviously these two cities had a different approach, but Newcastle in particular had a really surprising fever for spiritualism, which I wasn't quite expecting. But for those of you in the UK, you may have watched David Olusoga's series, A House Through Time. And he traced the history of this house in Ravensworth Terrace, and he covered briefly some of Newcastle's links with spiritualism. So that was where I decided to start. And in 1887, a draper named Bevan Harris moved into 5 Ravensworth Terrace. And in 1891, he lost 2 of his children. And then in 1892, his wife died from throat cancer. So this guy had a lot of horrible stuff happen very, very quickly, within like basically 12 months, essentially. So there he is. We've got a picture of him. Following their deaths, he then became involved with spiritualism, which is quite a common pattern. And he hosted seances at the house with local medium Annie Mellon, who we'll come back to. And he also wrote articles for the spiritualist newspaper, The Two Worlds. And he was almost desperate to contact his loved ones, which again is a motif that we see again and again with spiritualism, or people who come to it anyway. but he became convinced of the power of spiritualism to, enact change in the world. He did move away to Nottingham in 1894, but he continued to promote spiritualism until his death in 1900. But spiritualism had actually arrived in Newcastle some 30 years earlier. So it's quite interesting to see that this particular fella shows up with such a passion for it in the 1890s, but we actually can go back even further to the 1860s. And this is where Newcastle became a stop on the tour of a pair of spiritualist brothers, William and Ira Davenport, who arrived from Buffalo in New York State in 1864. Now, they'd shot to fame a few years earlier because they were apparently able to levitate musical instruments while they were playing. Incidentally, also something that sometimes happens in poltergeist activity, so quite odd that that would then appear as something that mediums were trying to make happen. They ran their seances in two halves. So in the first half, the brothers sat inside a cabinet, apparently bound to their seats with a clothesline, and musical instruments were put inside the cabinet with them. The lights would be dimmed, and then once everybody was in this state of excitement, anticipation, disbelief, whatever, the instruments would start playing. Now, bearing in mind, they're playing inside a cabinet, so people can't actually see what's happening. And this is said cabinet. And partway through the show, the cabinet would then be opened to demonstrate that the brothers hadn't actually moved. And at one of their seances, a clergyman actually got into the cabinet with them to actually affirm that they hadn't moved, but he did report feeling a spectral hand touching his face. However, he did say that it felt like a human hand, and it never seemed to occur to him that it might actually have been a human hand, which is quite interestingly. So, much like Morpheus would say, we do accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. So this guy thought he was at a seance where people could contact the dead, so that is what he experienced. In the second half of the seance, everybody would sit holding hands, which is quite common from seances. One of the brothers would be tied to his seat on the stage, and then the other one would sit in the audience holding hands with the people on either side of him. Now, the light would then be turned off completely, and again, musical instruments would start playing in the dark. And in this case, they would actually even hit audience members at times. However, and this is where we get into the sort of the Geordie mindset, as it were, because at one of the seances in Newcastle at this point in the proceedings, an audience member stood up and struck a match to see what was happening, and all the activity stopped, as you might imagine. The man who did so said that he'd seen William Davenport standing in the middle of the room, so clearly not either sitting down or tied to his seat as he was supposed to be. But the men sitting either side of William said that he hadn't moved, but they never considered that they might have actually been holding hands with each other and that William might have been wandering round and they were none the wiser. So I love the fact that someone just went, I'm going to see what's going on here and lit a match. This piece from the Newcastle Daily Journal in November 1864 shows that not everyone was impressed with their performance, because the letter writer, who signs himself anti-humbug, which I love, has noticed that the brothers don't let members of the public tie their bonds, and it doesn't take a genius to work out that they're tying false knots at this point. They did do a really expensive seance at the Queen's Head on Pilgrim Street, which for anyone who knows Newcastle is now Alderman Fenwick's house, and it was also once the centre of a body snatching scandal, but that's another story for another time. The second seance was aimed at much more modest ticket prices, and that happened on Nelson Street. I want to say that was probably in the music hall, which then later on went on to play host to Charles Dickens doing some readings. But the audience here, and bearing in mind this is the modest ticket prices one, the audience were quite sceptical, and one man even described it as a swindle. So again, isn't that interesting? So yeah, this guy, I was heartily glad at the unanimity of the condemnation of the humbug at the seance this evening. People don't write letters like this to the papers anymore. And then he also goes on to say the necessity of adhering to a certain programme is merely an excuse to ward off the application of tests which would soon unravel the mystery and expose the gang of Confederates to the disgust and opprobrium of the public. Oh, honestly, I love the way people used to write in the 1860s. And now, obviously, some of, and indeed probably many of the spiritualists were frauds, and they might fasten bellows between their knees to create ghostly sighs. They would have accomplices in the audience who would obviously touch or talk to the audience who thought that the medium was in a trance in the cabinet. If you asked the medium to do something completely new, often they couldn't do it and they'd say, oh, well, it's the spirits, they don't want to cooperate, they don't like you, blah, blah, blah. But then a few days later, they would be able to do it once they'd figured out how to do the trick. So you do have to wonder, were the spirits really that whimsical, or did mediums just need time to figure it out? And in some ways, they're actually quite impressive for the amount of trickery that they did manage to do. Not to say all of them were frauds, because obviously there will be people who do believe that mediums could contact the dead, but there were a lot of them who were just making it up. Which helps in some part to explain the founding of the Newcastle Spiritual Evidence Society in 1871. And yes, it is still there, and that is Osborne Road in Jesmond, which is basically where all the students go and live, which is quite interesting. But the society held lectures, but they also held seances under test conditions because they wanted to gather evidence to prove their belief was true. So rather than looking for evidence to say it's bunkum, they were going the other way. But it's quite interesting that they didn't automatically assume it was true, they still wanted evidence for themselves. By 1880, they had 151 paid up members, 15 honorary members, and 3 life members, which is quite interesting. But when I said we'd come back to Annie Mellon, she was actually one of their in-house mediums, along with C.E. Wood, and the results of their seances often appeared in the Spiritualist magazine, which is what we've got on screen here. So it's not specifically about them, it's just to give you an idea of how thorough this newspaper actually is. Now, in December 1875, Miss Wood was strapped into an armchair for the seance inside the cabinet, and she apparently manifested a spirit who would talk to the 20 society members who were present, so quite a sizable group, but wouldn't materialise because there were troublesome spirits present. Now, eventually, half of those society members left either because not enough was happening or they just had other things to do. But at that point, the spirit decided that she would actually materialise and then apparently did so at the entrance of the cabinet. So people thought they were looking at a spirit rather than the medium. The spirit, who called herself Pocky, apparently wanted to satisfy the new members that were present, who are presumably the ones who stayed. Eventually, she disappeared, and then, having been in a trance for 3.5 hours, Miss Wood was finally released from the armchair. Now, in 1880, she held 35 seances in 1 quarter alone under test conditions, although the society noted, and I quote, the phenomena were good, but not nearly so regular in evolution as those of the earlier period, end quote. So it does imply that she was a bit hit and miss at times. This is the other one. This is Annie Mellon, the one I said would come back to, along with one of her spirits, a young girl called Sissy. You can decide for yourself how persuasive you find that. Now, Mellon became interested in spiritualism when she was 17 and became a medium when she was discovered by the Newcastle Spiritual Evidence Society. And she had a couple of spirits who apparently always manifested for her, which helps to explain how she became an in-house medium. But after grievances over money, she left the society in 1877, got married in 1878, and started working independently. And she even gave seances in Australia, although the Australians were a lot quicker to go, she's fake, which again I thought was quite funny. Mellon claimed that the Society for Psychical Research endorsed her as genuine, which, if true, would have been a massive badge of honour. But investigators then found that was a lie as well. And 2 of the SPR members, Frederick Myers and Henry Sidgwick, actually attended 2 of her seances in Newcastle in 1875, and they described her abilities as suspicious, which doesn't really sound like the same glowing endorsement that she was claiming. She was eventually exposed as a fraud in October 1894 in Sydney, and she was caught using a mask, pretending to be a young girl, and researchers also found clothes and a false beard in her seance cabinet. So it's quite clear that Mellon, for whatever reason, was pretending to be these different spirits for her audience. But Mellon wasn't the only medium working on Tyneside, and in The Two Worlds, which is the spiritualist newspaper I mentioned earlier, I found a letter submitted by John Graham, who was an attendee at the seance in Tynedock in August 1894. The medium was John Huggins from Felling, and according to the letter, spirit forms appeared soon after Huggins entered the cabinet. Some of the sitters present recognised the spirits of a gentleman and a lady. Graham himself recognised the spirit of one lady, saying she patted me on the head, the shoulder, arm and hand, and also touched the sitter next to me. Now, obviously, mediums depended on audience members recognising the spirits that they produced, otherwise it would be fairly pointless. And in the book The Darkened Room about women in spiritualism, Alex Owen points out that critical audience members often remarked on the similarity of the spirits to one another, to the point of them almost seeming identical. But believers didn't care. because they had proof of the continued existence of their loved ones, and that was part of the reason why spiritualism did take such hold for some people. Now, the fraud of the mediums partially led to the formation of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. This is Henry Sidgwick, who I mentioned before, and the SPR sort of used what we would consider like as scientific as you could get at the time methods to test mediums and actually unmask several fakers over the years. So another example in the Northeast, a medium in 1905 called Christopher Chambers started to make a name for himself. So Arthur Neal, one of the SPR members, went to one of his seances when he came to the Northeast, and Chambers was supposed to be inside the cabinet, but then after the lights dimmed, a spectral form apparently rose from the cabinet. Neil just simply turned on a lamp to reveal that Chambers was wearing a sheet and a paper turban. Chambers tried to protest his innocence and submitted himself to a further 4 seance tests with the SPR, all of which proved he was a fake. He agreed to stop working as a medium, but lo and behold, he went straight back to his old tricks in the north, which is quite telling. But fraud also continued into other areas associated with spiritualism, and this came from an 1873 issue of the Spiritualist newspaper, where a Dr. Hugh MacLeod was advertising his services based at 103 Bell Terrace. He's listed as a magnetic and eclectic physician, and he's offering to treat acute and chronic cases of disease distance from the patient of no moment. And he basically makes his examinations by hair assisted by a clairvoyant. So you basically send him something of yours, and he will then use this clairvoyant to ascertain what's wrong with you, but then he'll cure you basically from home. It's like remote working in a way, but for someone claiming to be a healer. Now, he wasn't he wasn't the only one, because of the fact that there were other clairvoyants who claimed to be able to diagnose and treat illness at a distance, but it's quite interesting finding one in Newcastle rather than London. I did look up where Bell Terrace was because I wasn't familiar with it, and it was in Elsick, um, which would have been a really well-to-do area at the time, even though it's much less of a desirable address now. Um, but his status as a magnetic physician referred to the use of magnetism to supposedly treat disease, also known as mesmerism, which I mentioned earlier. It's not specifically part of spiritualism, but it does dovetail with it because magnetism claimed to be able to cure conditions including, and not limited to, inflammation, rheumatism, fever, heart and kidney disease, dyspepsia, scrofula, constipation, tumours, female diseases, and insanity. As a cure, it promised to replace narcotics, or the kind of hatred of the pharmaceutical industry had started even then. And some of its hyperbole is really reminiscent of the wellness industry now. When you think of the idea of people sort of, thinking that they can cure chronic conditions with, moon charged water or whatever, it's very, very similar to what we see here. Franz Mesmer invented mesmerism in the 18th century, claiming that all living things had an invisible natural force, and therefore a practitioner, obviously here a magnetizer, could then manipulate that force to produce effects in the body. And I even found this on archive.org if you want to go and read it, if you fancy some homework. And it's an 1881 manual about magnetism that includes a chapter about clairvoyance, recommending psychics to help with diagnosis before the practitioner does the actual healing part. Now, this is no doubt what recommended it to the spiritualists, and Dr. MacLeod would have found a much more sympathetic customer base through an ad in the Spiritualist than he probably would have done advertising in something like the Newcastle Daily Chronicle. I did search a couple of medical registers from the time and I couldn't find Dr. MacLeod on them, so there's a very good chance he wasn't a registered physician either. So ultimately, from all of this, we can see that the people of Newcastle did have a tendency towards skepticism when it came to mediums, but the popularity of the big public seances suggests that there was still an appetite to see them. Clearly, some people obviously were going because they believed in them, but I think the difference in the reaction to the audiences between the large events at lower class venues and the smaller events at the exclusive venues kind of suggests to me that the working class audience probably saw them as a bit of a form of entertainment, which is quite interesting. But what of Manchester? Did the industrial powerhouse of the Northwest treat spiritualism the same way as the industrial powerhouse of the Northeast? So, according to the Spiritualist in 1873, spiritualism did indeed take root in Manchester, but in private homes and at private circles. You didn't really get the public seances that you get in Newcastle. Many of the community's members came from two groups that had followed Emanuel Swedenborg's teachings, so this was a community that would appreciate spiritualism and what it could offer. People did attend lectures with authors present to discuss the contents of their work. And this book was quite interesting because it's called Where Are the Dead, or Spiritualism Explained. The author turned up at a lecture, but the book is published anonymously. So quite how anybody knew that was the author, I'm not sure. But there we go. People would go to lectures about these things. Now, it's again, you get lots of stuff written about in things like The Spiritualist, and it seems that most mediums basically work privately because of the public ridicule of what they were doing, and they preferred to sit for circles that weren't advertised or weren't open to the public. So it's a much more closed community in Manchester. Discussions of what happened in the seances do appear in The Spiritualist for a specialist readership, so we do still know what happened at them, but there's not the coverage of public seances as there is in Newcastle, which suggests that the spiritualists of Manchester preferred to work within a friendly community of believers rather than opening themselves to the kind of shenanigans that we see in Newcastle. And given that the Newcastle ones had all kinds of like ridicule since the 1860s, you could see why the ones in Manchester might go, maybe not. So it's understandable why they would do that. Now, one man named Mr. Blackburn, and this is all related in The Spiritualist, had addressed the spiritualist congregation and told of how his wife's cousin had disappeared 4 years previously. After 3 weeks of searching, including dragging the waters in the neighbourhood, they still couldn't find anything. So Mr. Blackburn went to see a medium in Stockport, who named the cousin that had gone missing as a John Charlesworth, and told Blackburn in which body of water they would find Charlesworth's body. So Blackburn then held a seance in his own home and received the same message. So obviously thought there must be something in this. I'm getting it from two sources. And he persuaded the mill owner to run off the water at the mill where this was supposed to be, and they found the cousin's body. Following that, Blackburn then began to develop his own abilities as a trance medium. So he'd obviously been convinced by what he'd seen sufficiently that he decided he wanted to investigate it and invest in it himself. Now, obviously, not everyone at these meetings was so convinced, and it did seem from some of the articles in The Spiritualist that some people attended the meetings because at one point they'd been fascinated by spiritualism, but the lack of results actually convinced them that there was nothing in it at all. So they weren't attending the meetings to cause problems, it's just they did so with less enthusiasm than they once had. And there's a bit of a sense that they've really had their faith in it shattered, but they're still kind of hanging on for like that one thing that's going to prove it to be true. There was also quite a fascinating spat in the Manchester Evening News after a report about the City Police Court had mentioned a spiritualists' hall in Nelson Street, and then E.W. Wallace wrote to the paper to tell them that that hall wasn't officially recognised by Manchester spiritualists and wasn't on their list of recognised meeting places. And it's almost like the vehemence of this guy having such an issue with this link to spiritualists. I was like, oh my God, what happened and why was a spiritualist hall being mentioned in the city police court? What on earth happened here? And this is where British Newspaper Archives is brilliant for this kind of drama, because you can just look back to the previous issue, which I did. And it turned out that a clerk named John James Young had been charged with stealing cheques worth £150 sent to his employer, obviously worth a lot more money in that particular era, so the 1890s. He'd hidden the proceeds in his rooms, and that was above the Spiritualist Hall where he was a member, which was known as the Christian Spiritualists Hall. So, did E.W. Wallace disown the society because of the fact it had been mentioned in the City Police Court, or was it some kind of renegade spiritualist society on the fringes? It's quite hard to say because it doesn't really appear again. And obviously, we can't say Young was a thief because he was a spiritualist, but what got me was how it was just threaded really casually into the news report. The way you might mention someone was like a member of a gym or something. It was really just, yeah, by the way, he's a spiritualist, which was quite fascinating. But why did spiritualism take root in Northern England at all? Bearing in mind, obviously, Manchester and Newcastle still relatively far apart, but general region of Northern England. Well, in 1851, not that you can really tell very well with the handwriting, but religious belief was added to the census, and places of worship were asked to collect data about attendances at services. Now, no one actually knew the best way to do it, so the data collected is really inconsistent because everybody has their own methodology. But even taking that into account, the low attendance at Sunday services alarmed quite a lot of people because London, Lancashire, Cumberland, Northumberland, and Durham, so you've basically got, apart from London, the Northwest and the Northeast quite substantially, reporting the lowest attendances, but also the highest interest in spiritualism. So again, we'll have to ask, why might that be? One potential explanation for that is the fact that obviously the Victorians had a much higher mortality rate than we do. And in 1870, a man's life experience at birth was just 39, and it was 42 for women. And the median age at death was 43 for men and 48 for women. And then that went up to 56 for men, life expectancy at birth in 1920. And then for women, it went up to 59. So it was obviously slowly going up. By comparison, in 2010, life expectancy for men at birth had gone up to 79, and it was up to 83 for women. So it's basically more than doubled between 1870 and 2010. Now, this was also an era in which people joined burial clubs, which were an early form of insurance scheme, so that people could set aside money for their loved ones. So you've got fewer medical interventions that actually worked. You've got harder, more dangerous occupations, particularly in the northeast and the northwest, where you've got a lot of shipbuilding and coal mining in the northeast, and then you've got sort of the factories and the mills of the northwest. And a lot of people point to the massive loss of life during the First World War and then the following influenza pandemic to explain the interest in spiritualism in the 1920s. But I would argue that you still have the same problems on a much more like everyday basis in earlier eras, which again explains the interest in spiritualism. People have also pointed out there's a boom in technology at the same time. So you've got things like the telegraph making communication possible across vast distances. So it's hardly surprising people might go, hang on, if we can talk across the ocean, can we talk across the veil? That kind of thing. Many people actually think that Thomas Edison tried to invent a spirit telephone. I mean, he probably tried to get the invention of somebody else, but he was basically more convinced that spirit communication would come through technology than a medium. Nobody's ever found a spirit phone, and the term was only coined in the 1940s. Edison himself tried to later claim it was a hoax, so some people think that he tried to distance himself from it when he couldn't get it to work. But it was quite a persuasive idea that there would be some way to make contact with the dead. And some people might be wondering, well, what exactly happened at a seance? And we've talked about the big public ones where you'd have people tied in cabinets, and there's a lot of people being tied up in seances as well. So I thought we'll have a look at a variety of things as we close the talk off, to see how people might actually try to contact the dead. And what's really interesting, I think, about seances is that all of them mostly depend on the presence of a medium. You almost can't have a seance without one. And the mediums work in sort of two ways. They either directly spoke to the dead, or they had a spirit guide who spoke to the dead for them. And that seems to be the main difference between them. How they then went about it differed as well. So some people would sit inside the cabinet to enter a trance, almost like a sensory deprivation tank. And that's when the assembled sitters would then experience the paranormal activity. And at this point, the cabinet is the thing that's allowing them to do their tricks. The sitters were primed to expect ghosts, so that's what they believed they were seeing. And then the medium might channel spirits, bringing forth ectoplasm, which was actually usually cheesecloth, or they might make items appear as if from nowhere, a practice known as apporting. So again, they would usually secrete them about themselves somewhere in sometimes less salubrious parts of the body, and then make them appear at random points to be like, ah, this is a gift from the spirits. Other times, this is the more classic image, I think, of the seance. Now, this actually comes from Fritz Lang's 1922 silent film Dr. Mabuse, but this is where people would then hold hands around a table. Holding hands is usually believed to keep the circle intact, and what you'll often hear is people saying, oh, it's to help build up the energy for the spirits to speak to you, but it's also quite helpful to make sure that you can see everybody's hands so that nobody's apparently faking anything. And in these instances, the ghosts would then materialize around the circle, and they would sometimes touch or speak to the sitters as necessary. But spiritualism, and obviously that's what you tend to see in films, I guess, most often. But spiritualism also gave people the opportunity to be their own medium, which is what I find really quite egalitarian about it, the fact that you could also do this for yourself. So it's very much like a do it yourself at home method, which is quite cool. And there were three techniques in particular that we're going to have a quick look at. And again, we don't know who anyone was actually contacting, if anyone, but so if you do decide to try any of these and anything happens, then that's your choice to do so. So that's my disclaimer from this. Now, the first one is automatic writing. And this is where a medium enters a trance and then keeps the hand moving across the page. And then the spirit uses their hand to write a message. Artwork has often been channeled in such a way. This is the automatic writing of the medium Leonora Piper, which is alleged to come from the spirit Richard Hodgson. It's obviously a lot quicker than rapping and asking yes or no questions and things like that. A sole participant can do it, so you don't actually need a crowd. And it obviously requires very little in the way of equipment. Noted Victorian artist Evelyn de Morgan was a staunch spiritualist, and she actually used to do automatic writing in private seances with her husband William as a way to contact the spirit world. And if you've never seen Evelyn de Morgan's work, you're in for a treat, because this is one of her paintings from 1881, The Angel of Death. Now, Evelyn and William did do their sessions together, so Evelyn would hold the pen, William would put his hand on her wrist before they entered a trance together so that they would both channel spirits. And they actually anonymously published some of their transcripts in 1909 as the result of an experiment. Now, this was obviously open to fraud because mediums could choose what to write. Often the garbled writing is impossible to read. My handwriting's terrible at the best of times, and I did actually try automatic writing on a ghost hunt once. And seriously, it was just loops. You couldn't read anything in it, and it kind of becomes a bit like a Rorschach test. It's like, what can you see in this mess? Um, it does become basically a matter of interpretation rather than communication by that point. The fact it was taken up by the surrealists to contact the unconscious actually tells you a little bit about the usefulness of automatic writing. Obviously, is the medium contacting the spirit world, or are they actually just, is their unconscious having a chat with you? Who knows? But it does look really good in cinema because you do see it in the Others and the Insidious franchise as examples for how it can make a seance look a bit more interesting. Another technique was table turning or table tipping. And basically with this one, you all stand around a table, ideally one with a little bit of potential wobble. So like a 4-leg table is quite a good one, a bit like this, so that you can get some momentum going, and you ask the spirits to move the table through you. Now, if you manage to get it levitating like they have, then you've clearly done something right. Science legend Michael Faraday did disprove it in 1853 thanks to the ideomotor effect, which if you've ever listened to anything involving Kieran O'Keefe, you'll know what this is. If you haven't, it's basically where your muscles operate without you consciously thinking about it. So the muscles in your fingers and hands will move without you being consciously aware of it. So the table moves because you want it to move. So the finger muscles move, and then you get the momentum going, and then it sort of takes over from there. It's dead easy to do, quick way to liven up a gathering. So people actually took to table tipping as a really simple way to hold a seance. Not sure how anyone would react if you tried it in IKEA, but if anyone gives it a go, please do let me know. And the final technique, which I'm sure everyone knew I was building up to, was the Ouija board. And I have a Ouija board. One of the guys at work made it for me on the laser cutter, and I put it in the loft. Cannot find it. So that's kind of a bit eerie in and of itself, but quite frankly, we could have the One Ring up there and nobody would know. It's a bit like, Warehouse 13. Um, but I just thought when a Ouija board goes missing, it is kind of a bit weird. Because they have such a sinister reputation, and that's even among people who find themselves or consider themselves quite rational. So again, I took it to a talk where I was doing this, and I handed it around, and this one woman just refused to touch it. And I'm like, it's literally a piece of wood that has had some letters laser cut onto it. It's never even been used as a Ouija board, but she just wouldn't even touch it. And it's weird because it's got a less than evil origin story, because it was basically a form of contacting the dead that came out of alphabet calling. So a spiritualist would recite the alphabet and the spirits would then rap at specific letters. As you can imagine, it took a really long time to uncover any messages doing that. And in a way that always kind of makes me feel a bit like it was like spiritualist dial-up at that point. But then the spiritualists moved on again, and they then had an upside down basket that they pushed a pencil through. People would then put their hands on the basket, and then obviously it would move around, and the pencil would hopefully spell words out. You can probably see where this is going. And then in 1886, a pointer and an alphabet board replaced the paper, pencil, and basket. and this is what we're far more familiar with now. So, in 5 years after this, the Kennard Novelty Company patented the familiar design that we're all familiar with now. Adverts for Ouija, the wonderful talking board, appeared in a Pittsburgh toy shop in 1891. Some believe that the name is a combination of the French and German words for yes would be oui and ja, but in fact, a sister-in-law, of a company founder actually asked the board what it was called, and she said that it replied Ouija, and when they asked what it meant, it said good luck. So make of that what you will. Um, and basically, again, fraudsters got involved. People started to believe that it was impossible to use Ouija boards to talk to the dead, and they just became a silly parlor game. People got them out if a party was a bit dull. You know what I mean? It's like it really was just this quite mundane humdrum thing that you would have around the house. So you might be asking, why did Ouija boards become associated with the occult? And the simple answer is, obviously, there's an example. There's a Ouija board at a fancy dress party. It was the Catholic Church's fault. So in 1919, Pope Pius V asked the psychic investigator J. Godfrey Roper to write a book about the Ouija board. And this was The New Black Magic and the Truth About the Ouija Board. And it included really dire warnings and urged Christian households not to tolerate the board. And everyone ignored him, just kept using their Ouija boards. And in the 1960s, there was the combination of the growing counterculture and then a general interest in the occult, which saw the Ouija board actually outsell Monopoly one year. And if you've seen the sequel to the Ouija movie, first of all, I'm sorry. But secondly, you'll also know how the board was really accepted as just quite normal in the 1960s. So everyone's loving it. It's all fine. Life's grand. And then 1971 happens, and William Peter Blatty releases The Exorcist. 2 years later, the film hits cinemas, and people then seize on this depiction of Ouija boards as conduits for evil spirits, and then the evil reputation stuck. So people had been using the board for like a good 80 odd, 60 odd years at least, if not more, by that point. But then, boom, this book comes out, and everyone goes, "Oh my God, it's fiction, it must be true." And therein lies the problem. So how do you actually use Ouija boards, might be your question. These two are doing it wrong because you should have 3 or more people. 2 people, it's far too easy to push, as you can see the woman clearly is doing here. Everyone should sit around the board, place their fingertips on the planchette. It's easier to use the middle finger because if anyone sort of presses with that finger, you see the end of the finger go white because of the pressure. I've also been a ghost hunt where people have had you actually put your hand upside down so you're touching it with your nail because it's nigh on impossible to push the planchette. Well, I mean, it is still possible, but it's harder to push it with the fingernail. Or at least it's a lot more obvious when someone's pushing it. Then you would open the board, ask any spirits that are present if they want to say hello, do they want to pass on any messages, etc., etc. And in theory, any spirits that are present can then use the energy of the people around the board to push the planchette, including obviously spelling out letters, or spelling out words rather, with the letters. When you're finished, you then close the board, say it's closed, and say that spirits can no longer use it to pass on messages. Now, it might sound strange, but an article on the Smithsonian's website says that the board actually got a patent at the patent office. I got really excited thinking, oh my God, someone demonstrated that it worked. But somebody actually said, no, 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 that's not how patents work. It just meant that they demonstrated it basically did what the toy was supposed to do. They didn't demonstrate that they'd actually spoken to the dead, which I was really disappointed by. But yeah, the Ouija board has a patent. And here's Barbie using a Ouija board. You didn't see that in the Barbie movie, did you? Now, you can obviously fake using a Ouija board. Obviously, some people insist on saying out the entire word before it's been finished spelled or finished being spelled, which I find kind of rude because who finishes someone's sentences for them? One person can push the planchette really easily. I've never seen anyone do that to pass on negative messages or to scare anyone. I've only ever seen people making it all about them and essentially getting a bit of attention or a bit of drama. And humans really don't like unanswered questions. So again, with that idiomotor effect, sometimes you can find with the planchette, it's almost like people are like forcing it without realizing that they're actually exerting any force on it, which is worth bearing in mind. Now, in his excellent book Paranormality, Richard Wiseman also offers another possibility, which is kind of interesting, that you're not talking to the dead using a Ouija board, you're actually talking to your own unconscious, much like the automatic writing. So if you were to use the board blindfolded, i.e. all the participants were blindfolded, but then there was one person paying attention to what was going on, If it's still spelled out legible answers, then oh my God, that could be something quite impressive. But otherwise, you can't rule out human bias. Now, there are weird experiences about the boards. In 1921, a Chicago woman insisted that she wasn't suffering from mania, but instead she maintained that she'd left her mother's corpse in the living room for over a fortnight because the spirits told her to. And they also told her to bury the body in the backyard. That also sounds a little bit like a woman who's kind of had some sort of traumatic incident there, I must admit, but there we go. In 1930, two women in Buffalo murdered a third woman after apparently being encouraged to do so by a Ouija board. Again, that was probably an excuse. And in 1958, a woman in Connecticut tried to leave $1,000 to two former servants and $152,000 to a spirit she'd met through her Ouija board. So I don't think that you can say that the boards are evil. People have committed evil acts and carried out atrocious deeds well before Ouija boards told them to do so, and people still continue to do so without being told to do so by Ouija boards. So, to me, they're a product of their time. They demonstrate that fascination with technology that the Victorians had, and it just shows how they like to bring technology into pretty much anything that they could to make things more efficient and so on. And I think in closing, spiritualism, I just thought this was quite an interesting picture from a ghost hunt to end on, because I think this is sort of where spiritualism seems to have ended up to some degree. And I think it might be seen as a strange Victorian quirk, but spiritualist churches still exist. There are still people conducting spiritualist medium meetings and so on, and doing seances and investigating. Can you contact the hereafter and so on? Um, and I think that in and of itself is really fascinating. But then what's really weird is the way that you've got this ongoing popularity of TV psychics. You've got influencers who are channeling messages as part of their marketing, and then you've got the what's the word? Oh, I'm not braining now. I want to say eponymous, and that's the wrong word, but these kind of ghost hunting TV shows, which demonstrate that we're fascinated by the beyond because we don't know what happens next. It's an unanswered question, and like I said, humans don't like unanswered questions. And I think where the looming threat of mortality in the Victorian age and then following the 1919 flu pandemic showed this desire to communicate with the dead or to find some certainty about what happened next, indeed some comfort about what happened next. The same questions got asked after the first lockdowns with COVID in 2020. So I think far from spiritualism being an outlier, I think that it actually shows a human curiosity that will always find some way to express itself. You've even got people trying to talk to the hereafter through ChatGPT, apparently not quite grasping that that is literally a large learning or a large language model. It's not sentient, but people are still doing it anyway. And I think that when we look back at the original sort of part of this talk, that the people of Newcastle both embraced and ridiculed spiritualism in equal measure, I think says a lot about the Geordie character, to be honest, especially among working classes who worked hard jobs in mines and in shipyards and doing really, really difficult things, obviously building railways and whatnot. And though I think that the decision in Manchester to explore spiritualism among sympathetic communities shows a lot more forethought, quite frankly, and less of a desire to exploit a trend and more of a genuine desire to contact the hereafter. So there's much more of a sense of like genuine exploration and taking it seriously in Manchester, as in Newcastle, it's kind of like, let's poke fun at it a little bit, shall we? But I think the tendency of frauds to present themselves on both sides of the Pennines also is the most telling point of all. And I think that probably says more about humanity than the more noble goals of the true believers. Um, so sweet dreams from me on that. I thought it was quite funny doing this talk on Zoom because this is kind of the closest to a seance that I think many of us will get. Um, but yeah, so obviously, I do have references if anyone's interested. There are more than that. I suddenly realised I hadn't put them all on there, but these are all quite good. And yeah, there's lots and lots of newspapers, which obviously the references are on the slide, so you can always pause those as you go through. But that is that from me, Mark. Are there any questions?
Yes, indeed there are. That's perfect. Thank you very much. We'll just give you 30 seconds to take a breather whilst I ask everybody to please chat or emote their gratitude to Icy for that talk. Thank you.
Oh, that's better.
Good. Okay, I have turned on permission for people to start their video. Don't feel obliged, but if you want to join us in the room and pretend to be real people like we are, then do feel free, bearing in mind that this is still being recorded, so please be clothed before you do so. Yeah, just got to throw that out. I'll just scroll back through the chat. There are a couple of questions and comments that are worth highlighting. The first one that sprang to my mind was Sean noting that it's funny that while spiritualism has always been dominated by women, the leaders of the spiritualist organizations have almost entirely been men. Any
Yes.
comment to make on that? Other than, yes, you're quite right.
No, that's right. What's really interesting, I think, the one name that sprang to mind for me, and then I suddenly thought, oh no, she wasn't actually a spiritualist. She was part of the Society for Psychical Research, and that was Henry Sidgwick's wife, Eleanor. But she was kind of part of the group going, no, 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 this is not real. So yeah, that is, I think, yeah, that just speaks volumes about the way that we organize ourselves, doesn't it?
Doesn't it just? Sean did throw a question out here as well. I see, says Sean. Aside from ridicule, did any of the spiritualist mediums you have studied ever fall foul of the law with respect to how, in the eyes of the law at that time, spiritualism was a form of fraud?
I haven't really seen anything, and of course, I think most people would probably point to Helen Duncan, obviously, and the way she was uh arrested and what have you, for obviously being a medium, but then having to use the Witchcraft Act because they didn't have a Fraud Act yet. Um, but you don't really come across that many stories of people being arrested. Um, and I guess part of it is probably the fact that if you've gone to a public séance, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there had been, and I can't find any material for this, but I bet it exists somewhere, that there was probably some kind of disclaimer on it that a bit like you get now, like this is for your entertainment only. Um, but I feel like when these people were being like exposed as frauds, it was nearly always by industry bodies rather than sort of police forces. And I suppose I'm not really sure um that anyone would necessarily want to get involved with stuff like that because um then you've got the burden of proof of how do you know that they're frauds. And I guess obviously being told you're a fraud kind of killed your career, so it was, you know, a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? A bit of a punishment and a penalty. And obviously not for the fella who just kept going back to it again and again, but there's always one. But yeah, Helen Duncan would be the main one I would think of who fell foul of it. But I can't help thinking if she hadn't been making, if anyone's not aware of Helen Duncan, she'd apparently contacted a sailor from a ship that had been sunk during the war. And she'd sort of said the name of the ship because it was apparently on the sailor's hat band, which obviously you wouldn't actually have had at the time. And the authorities got word of it and they thought, oh my God, like, does she either A, somehow have this information that she's leaking ahead of time, or B, like, is she actually getting this from the spirit world? And they all decided she was a fraud because there'd been quite a lot of discussions of her faking things before. So yeah, she was kind of arrested sort of because they were worried that she was spilling war secrets. But she's the only one I can really think of. But there was obviously other context to that, but you don't generally get them in the Victorian era. It's more just people writing nasty letters about them in the paper.
And they do write a good letter back then.
They really did. Honestly, some of the letters are sometimes more interesting than the articles.
Yeah, I do love a Victorian letter. There's yeah, the Victorian equivalent of Major General retired from the sort of 1950s and 60s is much, much better. There's a musing, I can't call it a question, but a musing from Tracy that was just below this here, who said, I wonder if the Great Depression played a part in people wanting to connect to the spirit world. There was some discussion after this about the fact that World War One and World War Two obviously have that effect. But did the Depression have a similar effect?
Um, you don't really see a huge amount. I mean, it's a difficult one because of the fact that you get like this little like of spiritualist activity sort of in the like 1919 until about 1924-ish. It's difficult to find if there's another one. That I would hazard a guess there probably would have been. It just probably wasn't being reported on in the papers because of the fact that they were busy talking about the depression. So I wouldn't have been a bit surprised if there had been some kind of interest. But I would love to know who the interest was from. If it was from, um, let's be honest, bankers trying to find out some financial information, or something like that. It'd be really interesting to see, because this is the thing, when you look all through history, there's loads of evidence of powerful men consorting with magicians and so on. You get this quite a lot, when they're sort of like making their fancy um amulets and things that Tabitha Stanmore talks about in Cunning Folk, to sort of like get preferment from the royals and things. So I'd be very surprised if bankers weren't going to mediums going like, can I have some advice about what stocks and shares I should buy? Um but yeah, so there isn't anything then massively that I've noticed. But yeah, you don't really get a huge amount of it after the Second World War either, which is really surprising. I would have expected to see some there, but I don't know if it's just because, again, everybody was sort of just thankful it was over, maybe. Um, I don't know. There's more research to be done there.
Excellent. Thank you. If you have any other questions, anybody do either raise a hand or drop them in the chat. Something that occurred to me, and this is maybe slightly off topic, but that's not a surprise, really, I suppose. Your Fritz Lang slide. Aside from the fact that it's blatantly obvious who the medium is in in that lineup, just got me to thinking the fact that your PhD obviously is in film and haunted houses and similar, and the representations of them in film. So I just wondered what yours, or in fact anybody else can pitch in on this one as well if they want to. What your favourite or best realised séance scene in film or TV is?
My favorite one, 'cause I've got a whole talk on this, and it's difficult not to just pick like my favorite medium, even though she's not technically a medium. And that's Jane Asher in the Stone Tape.
Mhm.
I think the way that she sort of, because she doesn't sit down and do a seance, so she's kind of a medium. But in terms of actual seances, I really do like the way that they depict it in The Woman in Black. Because it's not like a formal seance setting like you get in the others, or like I say, the Insidious films or anything like that.
Which Woman in Black? The
Oh,
Nigel Neal one or the Daniel Radcliffe?
the 2012 Daniel Radcliffe
Yeah.
one. And it's because um Mrs. Daly, she's obviously lost a child, but she sort of channels kind of warnings about like what's going to happen to the next child, and she sort of like draws them onto whatever surface is available. So she is actually channeling really useful information, but you never know who it's from, if it's from Janet or if it's actually from the children.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of like manic energy that comes with it is a really interesting, much less passive form of mediumship. Because again, a lot of the ones that you see, and they're just kind of all sitting around like holding hands and that, it's like, that's a bit boring. Whereas at least like with Mrs. Daly, like there's a bit of like, action going on with it.
Throw your favourite seances in the chat, everybody. I've got the Woman in Black on my mind at the moment because I'm speaking at an event in a couple of weeks, at which is also appearing Pauline Moran, so I get to meet the Woman in Black.
Cool.
At least the Nigel Neal
Yeah.
version of the Woman in Black, which is very exciting. I'm also going to go and see it on stage yet again
Oh,
at
it's
the end
so
of
good in
October for
theatre.
about the millionth time. But you can't, you can't see it too many times, right? I think my favourite's probably I don't know, Penny Dreadful. I
Mm.
liked the séance in the first season of Penny Dreadful. I thought that was very well done. Ask her to do the scream. Yes. I'm sure that'll come up. Yeah. I liked the séance in Penny Dreadful. I thought that was very good. Sean says there's a fab one in 70s Giallo, the night Evelyn came out of the grave, but also the one in Night of Demon is kind of great.
Mm.
There you go. And Colette, I really like the scene in the recent film Emily about Emily Bronte, where they used a mask to give a real sense of the uncanny when she channels her dead mother.
I haven't seen that, but I feel like I should know.
Yeah, I feel like we all should now. I have also not seen it, but that does sound good. Marvelous. Any more for any more? Anybody else got anything else that they would like to ask before we move on to um, the sharing of links and places where people can find you online. Uh, okay, I think probably not then. So let's just wrap up with Icy. Please tell everybody where you would like them to go to find you on the interwebs.
I'm just trying to get my link there. Best one is my website, which has social media buttons at the bottom, to Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. Um, and there you can sign up for my email list if you're interested. I'm on Patreon as well. Basically, anywhere that you look for Icy Sedgwick, I'll probably show up. What was really weird though was I was trying to find a page for something else where I'd done like a guest blog post, and one of the frequently asked questions on Google was, "What is Icy Sedgwick's real name?" And I was like, "Rude." That was just really, really odd. Um,
It's been
in
so long
terms
that you've forgotten what it is now, isn't
Well, yeah, and I thought, imagine if I had to Google it to find out my own real name. That would be hilarious.
it?
And that's the website feed for um the if you want the audio version of the podcast, or there's the YouTube version. The YouTube one, sometimes I do actually put things in the video, but a lot of the time it's basically useful if you want the episode but with captions, which A can help with my accent, but B it's sometimes quite useful to see how things are spelt as well, particularly names and things. And that's always good when I get um sort of people on talking about other people's work and stuff, when I get guests on and stuff. So I think a couple of people use it as like a weird kind of folklore ASMR, which is quite nice. So that is available if anybody needs it, and obviously you can subscribe to that for free. And then you can post comments underneath that and have a conversation with you, which is quite nice.
Fantastic. And there have been comments tonight about how people could listen to your accent for all day. So that's all good. No captions required there, obviously. If you are interested in the work of the Folklore Library and Archive, you can find it online at the very simple folklorelibrary.com. Please be aware that we are rebuilding a lot of the website at the moment. All the stuff is there. It might just not look quite as pretty as normal, but everything is there. And more importantly, if you want to support the work of the Folklore Library further outside of these talks, then you can visit this link, bit.ly/FLA fundraising, which is the link to our major fundraiser. The Folklore Library and Archive has recently acquired new premises and is in the throes of moving at the moment. We have also started to be contacted by people who want to give us ridiculously sized bequests of materials, not ridiculously sized bequests of money, sadly, but materials. So we've just taken on a bequest from a storyteller who is finishing her career as a storyteller. So she's thrown 1,000 books our way, plus a lot of boxes of artifacts, which is quite significant. And we've also recently been contacted by John Widdowson, one of the UK's most eminent academic folklorists, now in his 90s. He has an extensive collection of document archives and other materials. A large part of it went to Sheffield University. Unfortunately, not all of it. He didn't really want it to be split, but it had to be for various reasons. So Sheffield University took a lot of it, and when I say a lot of it, it was estimated at 3.5 tons of material in the back of a van that went to Sheffield. But he still has quite a bit of stuff, and he wants us to have the rest. And this is both good for our reputation because it means that people take the work we do very seriously, and also somewhat terrifying because I don't actually know how much more material there is, but I believe it to be a not insignificant amount. So our charity's major fundraiser there on that bit.ly link really is just for the ongoing campaign to help to fund the rental and the associated costs of making the library and archive available to the public. We hope to, at the end of September, beginning of October, begin to open properly to the public in our new location, which means you can come and get a reader's ticket and work with the library and with the archives in our space, and all of those things that libraries and archives are supposed to do. There are also going to be various remote options for people who obviously can't visit us in person as well. So keep an eye on our website for that. As I say, this is the start of a programme of talks which will be announced very soon. We have speakers programmed every 2/3 weeks from now through until January thus far. It will continue after that. That's how far we have programmed. Those talks will go live very soon on the Eventbrite page and also via our social media and the website. The next talk is in 3 weeks' time, which I believe is Saturday, the 3rd of October. And to give ourselves a breathing space in order to get all of the other external speakers arranged, myself and my wife Tracy, who is the co-author with me of Devon's Forgotten Witches, which is a book that came out last month, looking at witchcraft cases, forgotten witchcraft cases from the archives in our part of the world in Devon between 1850 and 1910, which is far later than most witchcraft cases that get reported by quite a long way. So we'll be doing a talk in 3 weeks' time on that subject. So witchcraft cases between 1850 and 1910 as they were recorded and reported in the press, and how they really aren't that much different to those that you find in the 17th century, with some notable exceptions. So you'll be able to book for that very soon. Thank you. There's a good link. Yes, Tracy did talk about the book on fabulous folklore, and you can go and learn a bit more about it there in the meantime. All of our talks will be priced the same, so £5 plus the inevitable Eventbrite booking fee. Sorry, I can't do anything about that. That's the way they work. So we hope that you will join us for more of those in the future. But in the meantime, please, as I stop recording, show your appreciation once more to the fabulous Dr. Icy Sedgwick. Thank you, Icy.